Hello and welcome to the, what month is it? September live stream. September. It's a good start, wasn't it? Get the month right. That would be an excellent start to the live stream.
That makes it natural.
Welcome to September live stream, Ask iToo live stream. It's your monthly chance to ask myself and Jaime any questions that you might have. And if you haven't got any questions, we've got plenty that have been sent in over the last 30 days that we'll share with you, some of the more interesting ones that I think would benefit a number of our users. So we're going to go through those today. I've got about 10 lined up. How many of those we get through depends on how many questions you ask during this show. So before we do that, though, I think we have an announcement, Jaime.
Yeah, thanks, Paul, and welcome everyone. We are excited to look at the three last months of the year. And for your information, as we unveiled last time, the beta for Forest Pack 8 is now available on the website, so you guys can grab it from the forum. Paul is showing it on screen. And our idea is to release the stable version within 1 month. I would say between the end of October and the beginning of November, Forest Pack 8 should be officially released. And in addition to that, we are being ambitious and we would like to release major version of RailClone before the end of the year. This is something we're going to try. We can't assure the whole thing, but for sure that you guys will have a version of Forest Pack, a new major version, that's Forest Pack 8. That again, grab it from our website, test it, send feedback, and expect the stable version in 4 or 5 weeks. So, Paul, we have an hour ahead. Let's go.
Great. Yeah, so we're not actually going to talk about the features of Forest Pack 8 now, but you can see a list if you head over to the forum of some of the things you can look forward to. Lovely. Okay, so there was a question before we even started, actually, so I'll just tackle that first of all, which was just in light of the latest update to 3ds Max, which included a new array modifier, which is pretty cool. What's the kind of future of the clone, not RailClone, just the free clone plugin that we publish? And are we going to stop releasing it? And obviously we won't stop releasing that. We'll continue to compile that for future versions of 3ds Max in order that all of your older projects will remain compatible with future versions of Max. The clone plugin itself, we don't kind of actively develop new features for it, so it will remain sort of more or less where it is. All of our energy for array-based modeling and parametric design all goes into RailClone. So the clone plugin will stay as it is and continue to be released for future versions of Max. All the exciting stuff goes into RailClone. So with that out of the way, the first question we got was, how do I clone lots of houses that use RailClone roof presets? That's an interesting question. Some of you may have tried this. We have these roof presets that are in RailClone, or you may have made your own. And what happens when you want to create a number of houses with that roof preset? Because, as you'll see, moving them around can be a little laborious. So if I pick this roof preset here, it's just one picture of the roof, and clone it by holding down Shift, that's fine. I can copy that over. And that's okay. It's taking a moment to update. But what you'll see is when I try and move it, it's quite slow, because every time I move the spline in the RailClone object, it's kind of having to update the array each time, even though it's technically remaining the same. So there's an easy way around that, and that's to use the recent features that were introduced in RailClone that allow you to kind of bake down the instancing into a proxy cache. Okay, so instead of having to calculate it on the fly every time you make a change, it just bakes down the existing distribution but retains all of the RailClone features and maintains and remains very, very efficient. And you can do that just by coming down into the display rollout, and here you can see there's a newish section here called proxy cache. Hopefully some of you are aware of it already, and you've got 2 modes there, which is embedded and external file. So embedded mode basically will just bake this distribution and save it inside the RailClone object in the scene. So it will make your file size slightly larger, but as you'll see now, if I pick this up and move it, it's no problem at all, full frame rate. And I could easily distribute that a number of times without really causing any trouble. Now there is another option there as well, which is to bake it to an external file. So with that, instead of saving it into this file, I'd save it to an external, a custom file type. And when you do that, obviously you've got all the same benefits, but you're not increasing the size of your max file, just like a normal proxy, really. Okay, so you've got those two options. That said, there is a bit of a trade-off, I would say, depending on how many objects you're creating. So, I mean, if I was creating this many, I probably wouldn't be distributing RailClone objects. I'd bake down one building there into just a standard proxy, and that's going to be far more efficient for you. And in fact, that's what I did to make that scatter there. You can see there's an insane amount of buildings there. Just to test if it worked, and that's a Corona proxy being distributed with RailClone baked down inside it. So that's initially sounds like a lot more polys, but when you're scattering this many buildings, it's by far the more efficient way to go. So that was the first question. We're aware that just having a look at the questions there. Have we got any there, Jaime? I can see some comments. I've got questions. Cinema 4D. Oh, Cinema 4D.
No,
Okay.
Cinema 4D,
yeah, we're not going to other. In the short term, we're not going to other DCCs.
I mean, I wish we could, but again, we are a small
yeah.
team of people and resources are limited, guys. So
Yeah.
we are playing with Unreal Engine. For those
We are playing with
interested.
Unreal Engine.
Yeah, we're playing with Unreal Engine, and we are aware that real time is going to be something huge in the future. But sadly, Cinema 4D nor other DCCs are not on the roadmap right now.
Rightio. Moving on. This was a question about combining Forest Pack and RailClone. There are increasingly fewer reasons to do this. You can do a lot in RailClone without necessarily having to integrate Forest Pack just for the trees, for example. But let's assume for a moment that these trees are animated and you really want to distribute them with Forest Pack instead of RailClone. How would you do that? How would you basically coordinate the planters in the pavement, which are in RailClone, with the trees that you're scattering in Forest Pack? So let's have a look at that. I'll just open the file up in the background and then switch back to the desktop. Okay, so just loading up the file. So it's pretty standard. I've already built the RailClone style. In fact, I think it's one of our presets, as I recall. So I just want to show you one way in which you could get something built with Forest Pack onto that pavement and have the two linked. So, so here we have, like I say, here we have our standard pavement. If I pop open the style editor, let's have a look at how this is made. And what we're interested in here is to work out how these planters are positioned along the pavement. And actually, I can tell you, these basins are in the evenly input. So you see if I unplug that, you can see they disappear. So they're in the evenly input. And I'm just going to check out these rules here to make sure I can reproduce those in a second RailClone style, which I'll do in a second. So it's in distance mode. I think it's 300 centimeters, and the adjust to end is 50%. It's in justify. Okay, just making a mental note of that. And the distance between trees is 300. Yeah. Okay. So what I'm going to do basically is to create another RailClone style that uses those same settings, and instead of distributing this quite high poly geometry here, I'm just going to distribute this triangle. And I'm going to use that triangle as a marker in Forest Pack to place objects on. So you could kind of do this in one style and have a switch between the geometry, but just for ease, I'll do it as a second style. So I'd create a new RailClone object, pop open the style editor here. See if I can put this somewhere a little bit more sensible. Okay, and then we'll go for a linear array, add a spline. And then, of course, we want to add the same spline. Got to use the same spline as the pavement, or this isn't going to work. And then we want to bring in this, just a triangle as a segment, and wire it into the evenly input. So there you can see I've got some triangles going along the spline. Now I want to match the settings. So I'm going to come into the rules, and in the distance setting, remember I said it was 300 centimeters. You could wire these together, of course. 300 centimeters, justify. That seems to be... You can see these down here, look, that seems to be lining up with the basins. So what I want to do now is to put those triangles roughly where you want the trees to be planted, in the middle of those circles there. So I'm going to go to transform, and I'm just going to do that manually. So I'll just increase it on the Z axis a little bit, move it back on the Y, and maybe down a little bit there. Okay, and that's our RailClone object done for the trees. And what will happen obviously is if I change this spline, then the markers will update to match perfectly the basins. Of course, if I change the distance between the basins, I'll need to do the same for this object too. And then once you've done that, you just pop into Forest Pack. I've already added the trees because I'm pretty sure everyone knows how to do that. And what I'm going to do is to change the mode in the distribution rollout from image to reference. And in the reference list here, I'm going to click on the plus symbol, and I'm going to pick that RailClone object I just created. Now what I've got at the moment is one tree, which is on the pivot point of the RailClone object. But if I change it to mesh faces, then I'll get one tree on every triangle in that mesh. Okay, and you can see that's popped them all exactly on the basins where we want them. And if I adjust this spline, you should see this all updates. Selecting the spline would be helpful first of all. There we go. There we go, that all updates. So that's a quick and easy way to kind of link together RailClone and Forest Pack. Just use triangles in RailClone. And actually this applies to anything. If you ever want to use kind of some of RailClone's features to create a distribution, but you actually want to put the geometry on there at the end of the day with Forest Pack, main reason for that would be for animated meshes, then you can just use triangles instead. And in that case, you've got the kind of power of both plugins together. Great. No more questions? No? Good.
No questions.
Lovely. This was a question we had relatively recently on Facebook, in fact, this one. How do I create procedural festoon lighting with RailClone? And specifically, the question here was, how do I do that but create the curve or the kind of sag in the cables and include that inside RailClone so that you can adjust their sag and stuff afterwards.
Paul, sorry to interrupt you, Paul. By the way, now that you mentioned social media, Facebook, I have a little request for all our audience and clients and friends. Guys, when you drop images on social media, you always mention your DCC and your render engine, but I don't know why you guys don't mention the plugins. So it would be grateful, and we would be very happy and grateful if you mentioned that you use Forest Pack and RailClone. I think it's a nice way for people to know that our tools are being used and are all around. So that was the request. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. That's a good point.
Yep.
It's always really gratifying anyway. I mean, we can usually guess if there's a tree in the scene. Forest Pack, RailClone's less obvious, but it's always really gratifying to see when something's been made with our plugins, and some of the work's incredible. So it's really pleasing to just to know that we had played some small part of that.
Yeah, because we were discussing yesterday whether we do a reel for archeries or not.
Yeah, we'd like to do a show reel at some point.
Years,
so. Yeah. So definitely, if you've get in touch if you've got some lovely footage that you think would be suitable for including in that. Okay. So the point here was that I've got this kind of I've got this spline here, which is for my cable. So I'm going to put a little sag in it by adding a vertex in the middle, and what I want to do is obviously distribute that between these posts there, but there are a few limitations, like how do you do that when the lengths between the posts are quite different, and how does the number of lights change between those, and so on and so forth. So let me just show you one solution to this. So I've already done some of the work just to save a bit of time here. So I've got that's the finished one. That's cheating. Show you that now. There you go. That's the one we're looking at. Okay. So this one here, I've already got just a a linear generator here. I've got the posts wired into the start corner and the end, and I've got a base spline, so nothing particularly fancy there. And I've also added a cable piece of geometry, which is just a mesh, which is here, just basically a cylinder. And I've got a light, which is a V-ray light down here. Now this could be a group, which is a piece of geometry and a light. That would be fine. So what I want to do is to create the cable section separately initially. So I'm going to bring in a linear array. I'm going to wire the cable to the spline input, and I'm going to wire the cable geometry to the default. There. And I'm just going to pick that from the scene there. Now you should see that there's a piece of cable now on that spline. What I will do is just change the alignment on the Z-axis to center, so that instead of sitting on top of the spline, it runs through the center of it. Now I'm going to put the lights along there too, and rather than do this inside this generator, I'm going to do it on a separate generator. And the reason is, if I just add these lights to the evenly input, that might work, but it will probably break apart the cable. You see there? So rather than kind of close that gap up all in one generator, it's much easier just to add a second generator. Use the same spline, and then we'll wire the lights to the evenly input. So something like that. So that's great. And now what I can do is obviously control the distance between those lights using the evenly settings from here, so I can change the number of lights and so forth. So now I need to get these wired into this part here. And what I can do there is to add well, I could just wire them straight into the default input, and you can see that's kind of working. But they're on the ground and I haven't got the lights. So I need to compose them together into one object first of all. So I'll do that, compose that to there. I'm going to set the mode to grouped, and then I'm going to put the lights in as well. Now if I hadn't set the mode to grouped, you'd get one after the other. So I'd get the cable then the lights, whereas if I set them to grouped, it aligns them based on their pivot point. So that's fine, that's all working fine. Now they're obviously on the floor rather than up at the top of the pole, so I'll add a transform node there. And I'm going to change the alignment on the Z-axis to top, so that they're on the top there. And then I'm just going to move it up on the Z-axis. I could do this by measuring the pole, but I'll just do it by eye. I think probably 200 centimeters, maybe a bit more. Something like that. Okay, so that's kind of working. And if I move this, you can see I can control the sag of those cables now, which is what we were after. But there are some issues with this, and some of you have probably spotted them. The number of lights should probably increase for the longer sections than the shorter ones. So you can see here I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and that's a short section. And here I've also got 6. I might expect to see more of those there. So we need to do something else to make that work. And what we can do is start to determine that evenly distance procedurally, using a bit of arithmetic, a bit of an expression basically. And first of all, what I'll do then in order for that to happen is I'm going to change the evenly mode from distance, because the distance never changes because it's always this spline here. It's just it happens to get stretched out, but it doesn't measure any different as far as RailClone is concerned. So I'm going to change it from distance to count. And in count mode, you just choose a number. Okay, like so. So what I can do now is I can export that, and I can control this count value based on, instead of the length of this spline, the length of this spline section here instead. And that will give me a little bit more control. So to do that, I'll export the count value. So evenly and then count. And then I'm going to, I've already got it here actually, I've got a numeric value here which is just an evenly distance that I've exported down to here. So it's set to 150 centimeters at the moment. And I'm going to take that and wire it to an arithmetic node so I can do some maths on it. Change it to expression and open edit expression. So here, we're going to do a little bit of maths, but nothing too hard. So what I want to do is to return whatever value I get from this next expression. So I'm going to type return. And I want to know the distance of each section of this spline. So not the spline that this generator is currently attached to, which is the curved part, but this spline here instead, the one that's attached to the main generator. And you can do that by using dot syntax or simply by just scrolling down, and you'll see a list of all the generators that are attached or somewhere in the tree for this particular arithmetic node. And what I can do is scroll down here, and I can see that somewhere in here there'll be X section length, and there it is. So I want to return main X section length, and you can see that this generator is called main. So I'm saying I want you to return the section length from this generator, not this generator, which is currently wired to. And then I want to divide that by this light spacing parameter that I've exported here, which is kind of the distance between those lights, and that will give me the number that would fit inside that spline. So in order to access that, these are inputs here, and they're simply numbered. So because this is the first input, it's just input 1. Input 1, like that, and a semicolon. Now obviously at the moment this is going to return probably, you know, like a fraction. It's not likely to divide exactly into that. So what I want to do is round it to the nearest integer, the nearest whole value, and I can just type round for that and then enclose the sum in brackets. So I'm just rounding it down to, or up to the nearest whole value, and hit evaluate. And now what I should see is that I've got more lights on the longer sections and fewer lights on the shorter sections there. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 there, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 there. So that's working fine. And I can also adjust the spacing from here, which is pretty cool. But there is a catch, because what's happening at the moment, of course, is that before this gets wired into this main generator and then scaled, it still starts off at this size, right? So it starts at this side. I've controlled how many objects are along it, so there might be 7 or 6, but the actual spline starts this long. And that means that when it's added into this main generator, the whole thing gets stretched or shrunk, depending on which way it goes. And you can see that actually these lights are getting stretched along the x-axis, and they're shorter on this side, look, where the length of this spline section more closely matches the length of my curved section. So what I need to do is to kind of compensate for the fact that they're being stretched out. And we can do that by taking our light segment and scaling it. So I'm going to put a transform node in there so that I can control it. And I'm going to right click on it and export the fixed transform, fixed scale, X setting. So I'm just scaling on the X-axis, don't need to scale it on the others. Hit OK. And now I need to use another bit of arithmetic, because basically all I need to do is work out the difference between the length of this spline, which is fixed, and this spline section, which changes. So I just basically need to create some an expression for that. So I'll wire the arithmetic node into the scale. I'll pop open the expressions editor, and now I need a couple of values here. So first of all, I want to return the value, so always remember to type that in, return. And now I want to find the length of this spline. Okay, so I can do that just by coming up here and going x-spline length. I don't need to use any dot syntax here, because this is the generator to which this segment is directly wired, so I don't need to tell it which generator to use. It will use this one by default. Now what I need to do now is to divide that by the length of the spline section on the final style. So here again we'll come down and find main, and this time instead of spline length I want the section length, so I'll find X section length, double click on that, and then that will give me a value possibly of 0 to 1 or thereabouts. What I need to do to get that into percentage, of course, is to multiply it by 100, put a semicolon to finish that line, and hit evaluate. And now you can see my lights are staying in proportion, as well as the numbers being able to increase depending on how long the spline section is. So that should create that kind of section. Nice thing is, like I say, it's fully procedural, so we can change the length of those, and we can also change the sag if we need to, which of course isn't as good as a proper kind of catenary curve kind of algorithm, but we can't do that at the moment. So this is good enough for most purposes. I hope that answers that question. I hope that's useful for people that might have tried to do that in the past. Are there any questions there, Jaime?
Nope. Today's quite smooth.
Let's move on. I've got a lot of little bits and pieces to get to today, so that's fine.
We got 30 minutes to go.
I've already used 30 minutes. That's crazy.
Yep.
Next question was animating groups, items inside a group, and then using those in Forest Pack. So some people may have tried to do this, where you're kind of, in this case, the rotors on the drone. You might have just tried to animate the rotation, put them in Forest Pack, and then actually nothing seems to happen. They stay still, like they are here. You can see they're just sort of not the actual things, but the rotors on the drones are static. Let me switch to desktop. Nearly forgot. So here you can see the rotors themselves are static and not rotating. Now, what you can't do in this group is just go in and I'm going to open the group and pick one of these, and you can't simply animate the rotation, because it will basically Forest Pack will ignore that, and it will just use the existing basic pivot point, and nothing will happen. So if you want to animate the rotation or the scale or the position of something and have it follow in Forest Pack and be animated, what you have to do instead is to add an X-form modifier, and then instead you animate that gizmo. So I would animate the gizmo on that, like so. So that should turn now. Great. And then we can copy that across to the others. Like so. So now I've got animating propellers. And if I come back to if I come back to here, then they should start to move. Yes, you can see now those propellers are moving. So that's how you can get transforms working in Forest Pack, basically. And I've used propellers in this case, but that pretty much applies to anything. If you want to animate something moving, then this is the way to do it. Could be the same, for example, if you want to add a bit of movement to vehicles on roads. You'll find if you just animate them moving and pop them into Forest Pack, nothing really will happen. If you animate the translation in Forest Pack, so you use the random transform settings and animate them moving that way, that will work, but you won't get motion blur. So if you want them moving and you want motion blur, then this is a quick way of doing it. Pop an X-form modifier on there, animate the movement a little bit, and then it will work in Forest Pack. So that's an interesting question. There is something which I'll cover in future, but Forest Pack 8 also offers another way of doing that, to do with using hierarchies, which is quite cool. Okay. Moving on. This has come up a few times in the past, and I don't think we've ever covered it, but how do you create a facade that has a curved top but a flat base? Can you do that in RailClone? And you can. So let me just open up a file and show you how that's done. It's quite nice and easy. Okay, so switching to desktop. So this is the picture we were just looking at, and this is the kind of finished article. So let me just delete this so you can see what I did. Okay. So you can see, not a complicated one for once. Nice and easy. So what we've got here is a piece of geometry just arrayed along this spline. Just one piece, very simple, very straightforward. What we want to do, or what the user wanted to do in this case, was to have this coming flat along the bottom so that it came up and matched this line up here, which was the top of the roof here. And so the first thing that we wanted to do was to change this so that it was vertical or stepped. Let's go for stepped in this case, so that it's no longer leaning in. You can see it's kind of leaning in to follow that spline at the moment, and we don't want that. So let's change that to stepped for now. Now we also want it to go below the spline, not above the spline. So currently it's above the spline. So we'll do that just by coming into the segments alignment and changing Z to top. So now it's underneath. Now, what we want to do now is to scale or size this geometry so that it fills in the gap between the spline and basically the RailClone pivot point, which you can see by this gizmo here is about there, but you could put it anywhere. And we'll do that by adding a transform node, right-clicking on it, going to export parameters, going to fixed size, and Z. So we're just exporting the size of it on the Z axis. Now, gosh, talking a lot about the arithmetic node today, but people often ask for this, so no harm in going over it a few times. This is the arithmetic node again. I'm going to change it to expressions so that I can access some attributes of the graph that aren't normally available. I'm going to wire it to the Z fixed size input. Open the expressions editor, and once again I want to output a value, so I'm going to type return. And this time I need to find the distance between the spline and the ground, basically. And to do that, you've got a setting here called X-spline coordinates, to X-spline chords. So this is one of the ones where you need to add something to the end of it. So you can basically choose where to find the coordinates on the X, Y, or the Z axis. So I want the Z axis here. So I'm going to type .z and a semicolon. Now, if I evaluate this, actually nothing's going to happen, and that's because from this position here, which is on the spline, down to the ground is a negative value, obviously. And you can't give something a negative size. You can give something a negative scale, but a negative size isn't really going to work here. So what I need to do is turn that negative into a positive, and to do that I'll use the function that makes an absolute value, which I recall is just ABS for absolute, and then I'll put in brackets the value that I want to make absolute. Now if you can't remember that, just go into functions and you can see all of the functions that you've got available here, including absolute, which is right here. Okay, and there's also a little bit of information on how to use it down there. Okay, so that's how that works. If I click OK now, let me just evaluate that and click OK, then hey, nothing seems to happen. Why is that? It's because I haven't turned it on. So if I go into the transform node, I need to turn on override fixed size, or nothing's going to happen. So that's kind of working, and you should see now that if I grab this spline and move it up and down, then the thing is scaling to fit the spline. I could also change the shape of it completely, and it will all kind of work as you'd imagine. Like so, which is pretty nifty. So that's how you can do that, and of course this works the other way too. So if I wanted a curved bottom and a flat top, then you can do that as well. I just need to put the RailClone objects pivot above the spline instead, and then probably just wiggle this spline around to update it. There we go. And of course I'd also need to change the alignment of this segment so that instead of being underneath the spline like it is at the moment, I need to be on top of the spline now. So there we go. So now I've got a flat top and a curved bottom. But you can see it's just this one little bit of code here. Absolute X-spline chords.z. You can do all kinds of stuff with that. It's quite good for fences and things when you want curved tops or all kinds of stuff. Great. Are there any questions?
Yes, indeed. We have a question from Oleg Statopoulos. He says, I have a question. I'm not sure if it has been answered in previous Q&As. Is it possible to make a tile floor with RailClone, but using random size tiles in random patterns?
Yeah, not in the way you've described it, because RailClone is entirely array based. So all the segments butt up against the ones above and below, and the rows are stacked on top of the rows below. So if something was entirely randomly based, the segments wouldn't all jigsaw together all nicely. But there are, maybe I'll tackle this next time, but there are various ways to kind of simulate that by making a load of pre-built collections of tiles that look random, but actually end up being kind of square or locking together in some way that's predictable. And then you shuffle those. You just shuffle between them. And if you've got enough of those, like if you don't need many, 3 or 4, and you randomize the rotation of them maybe as well, and you randomize the colors and so forth, then you can get a pretty good, pretty difficult to spot sort of version of a completely randomized tile floor. But because of the way that RailClone works, you can't just completely randomize it without gaps appearing. Yeah.
The second question. Yeah, the second question. This is a bit more tricky. Do you have any plans to simplify the RailClone? And is there any hope to see the 3D generator? Well, that's a tricky one.
The trouble is simplifying. I mean, RailClone is really powerful. So how do you simplify something but retain the flexibility and control? I think the best thing we can do with that really is to put more things into macros, so that and add more things to the library, so that you've got more places to start from that don't involve the lower level kind of creation of nodes like this. So in a way, I've started to do that a little bit, like this xspline chords.z thing. I've entered it as code there, but for example, in the macros here in logic array attributes, there is a thing called xspline variables, and instead of having to remember the code, you can come in here, and I could have just ticked that I wanted to.
Paul, sorry to interrupt you. I'm seeing your chat.
You are indeed. Yeah. So sorry, let me just go through that again. So yeah, in macros on the right here, there's this thing called xspline variables, and in here it should say xspline z coordinates. So I can just check that, and that exports xspline z coordinates, right? So that for some people is simpler than entering that, but that depends on the person. And of course, you've got to know that exists in the first place and how to use it. But this kind of thing, though, these macros are a way to kind of try and simplify RailClone, because there are various things in here that will help you to create things without starting from a blank slate, basically. And as we work to improve the libraries, you'll see more of that stuff going into the libraries too. So you've got some places to start from. There's a kind of a contradiction there as well, because adding a 3D generator in some ways would make it more complicated. And when you say a 3D generator, I'm assuming you mean like, so you've got it on 2Ds and then you've also got that third dimension, so a three-dimensional grid. And you can do that now, actually, by kind of, because now you can nest generators. So you could nest, 2 generators together to create 3 dimensions from 2 generators. So that's certainly something that's possible, and I can show you that again. I'd be interested to know what you'd like to use it for, so that I could come up with a demo that suits those needs. So if you'd like to let me know what you'd use a 3D generator for, then next time I'll have a demo for you. How about that?
So Amir asks again, is it possible to read the spline dimensions that's not connected to the generator or nested in it?
No, it's not currently. It needs to be a part of the graph, but there are ways of kind of cheating that by wiring things to graphs that then don't produce any geometry. So you can kind of connect stuff together, just put a null segment or something like that in it, and then you're able to kind of access those values without actually having to have that generator produce some actual geometry. So there are kind of tricks and cheats for that. Yeah. Cool. Okay. Moving on. We've done a few tutorials lately. You might have spotted them, to do with effects, forest effects. And one of the questions we got asked was, could you change the properties of a material based on their altitude? So there is an effect built in for that. So I will show you how that works. It's very simple, in fact. And it's very similar to one of the previous tutorials I showed you. So the actual setup is the same, but the effect is different in terms of how you use it in the material. So let me just load this scene up. It's a little bit bigger because of the mountain, so it'll just take a few seconds. I did decimate this mountain a little bit to try and speed this scene up, but it's still a bit slow. Hey, here we go. Okay, so simple mountain, nothing fancy, not great materials, but we're not going to see them anyway. I've got on here, I've got a tree on here, which is from one of the 3D Garden Snowy collections. And if you were to scatter that as it is, then you're going to get that, which of course has snowy trees, but only the snow line should have those trees on it, which is up here somewhere. Now I could split this into two generators, two different forest packs, one with the snowy trees and one without. But just to illustrate in this case, I'm going to remove the snow procedurally using a forest effect. You could use it for tons of other things, but this is just a really clear demo of how you can use this and how it works. So it's pretty straightforward, in fact. What I'll do is I'll come into forest pack, and I'm just going to scroll down. There's already a forest effect in here because this mountain has displacement on it, and obviously displaced geometry will change the shape of the mesh at render time, which the forest pack will ignore because it's at render time and forest pack reads the mesh before render time. So this particular effect is in here already, allows you to wire the displacement map, same displacement map as being used on the surface, to the forest pack object, and then you connect it to the displacement modifier, and it moves the scatter to match the displacement basically. I'm sure you know about that already. There's a tutorial about that on our YouTube channel otherwise. So that's not the one I want to talk about today. I want to talk about instead this one, which is called Tint by Altitude. So we just basically click that and load it up. It doesn't have too many settings, you'll be glad to know. So first of all, it's got an altitude range, or an altitude, sorry. It's got a range, and it's got a remove bottom option. So the altitude is basically the point at which you want the texture to change. So it's a simple measurement from the forest pack object upwards. And the only trouble is it's quite difficult to see where that is without rendering it. And so I've added this remove bottom function here, which you turn on just by changing this value to 1, which is just purely used so that you can see where the altitude value is. So I'm just removing the bottom so that you can visualize basically that altitude value. So we want it up there somewhere like that. And then once you've got the altitude in the right place, you can turn this back off by putting it back to 0. And then the range is over what distance do you want this transition to take place, whatever it is you're going to do. Over what distance do you want this mask, which is basically what you're generating, to go from black to white. So let's say we want it over, I don't know, 10 meters, something like that. And that's pretty much it. That's all you need to do for the effect itself. Now, in order to use this to mask out an object in your materials, you need to do a few things. You need to come to the materials rollout, and you need to make sure that the random strength is 100% to 100%. Otherwise, it will just kind of randomize between your masks. So you want that to be 100%, 100%. Other than that, you can leave that well alone. And then in the materials itself, just open the material editor. Here it comes. And the material itself, you just use your forest color map here as a mask. Okay, so you can use this for anything, anywhere where you want to mask between two materials. I'm just happening to turn off the snow on these trees, but you could use it for anything between two values. So it's going to output black and white, but that's what we want for a mask. And what we need to do is to make sure with this that override isn't on. Okay, so override needs to be turned off, and this is also how you can control which forest color maps can be used for masks, because any other forest color map I've got in the scene, like this one for example here, I don't want that to be outputting black and white, so I need to make sure that override is on in that case. You can see there it's turned on. This one here, which I'm using for a mask, is turned off. And then the other thing I need to do is this blending mode here, which is always by default set to color, needs to be set to normal. Otherwise it's just going to output, you know, well, nothing really. So I need to change that to normal. And then that's all I need to do. And then I can use this anywhere I want as a mask. Now what I'm going to do in this case is I've got a snow material, actually two snow materials for a blending map. And what I'm going to do is just wire it to the opacity input in this case. So I'll just wire that to the opacity input. excellent responsive material editor. Come on, here we go. Opacity input like that. So I just wiped those two. And then if I were to render that now, basically because of that, I'd have removed the snow up until the snow line. I won't render it because it will kill my stream, but it will look something like this, which is just a very hard line at the moment, but it does illustrate how it would work quite nicely. Okay, so basically below this line, I've used that mask to remove the snow, which is quite straightforward. It's quite a handy effect. There's loads of useful forest effects in there, and we're going to be adding more because we've added some improvements to forest effects in Forest Pack 8. You can see that in the list of changes on the forum. Moving swiftly on. This one has come up a bunch of times in the last 30 days. This is just one example, but cutting holes in multiple sides of a building using one RailClone object. Sometimes works, sometimes doesn't, can be a little bit unpredictable. How do you control it? So let me open up this basic scene here and show you how it looked before we added a little bit of manual control. So clipping materials. Switch back to desktop. There we go. Okay. So you can see the problem here. Currently it's filling every kind of part of that spline. And what we want to do is just take a little bit of control over how it deals with multiple splines inside one another. If I open up the style editor, I can show you how this works. Basically, in your 2D generator, if you come down to the clipping area, which is what this is used for, and extend XY size to area, you've got this option here, which is called hierarchy checking. Okay, hierarchy checking. And that mode has a great deal of control over how we deal with multiple splines like this. So in the mode it's currently in, which is none, basically every spline is dealt with separately. So as you can see, every spline that we're using here is generating a whole separate array, which is clearly not what we want. So most of the time we might try complete, and complete will generally try and guess how to kind of combine those splines together and work out what is one facade and what is another. And it sometimes does an okay job, sometimes less of an okay job, and sometimes it misses completely because, you know, it's like we're asking it quite a complicated thing. So that's clearly not working either. So what we need to do now then is to give it a hand, basically. We need to give RailClone a little bit of a helping hand to identify which splines belong to sit which side. And we do that by changing the hierarchy checking mode to by material ID. And then what you can do is you can come in and you can start to assign material IDs to these spline sections so that we're telling it which ones belong together. So, for example, we know these are one side, so we'll give them a different ID. And you can see that immediately fixed that side because it knows they belong together. You can do the same here. Give it a different value. And this one finally. And you see that fixed it instantly. So it's very easy to do, but maybe not so aware that there is there or how that works. But that's basically it. Just group together your splines using material IDs and use that third mode in RailClone if you're using clipping areas. Okay, so that was a nice easy one, I hope. This was a kind of interesting question. How do I scatter a crowd? I actually had two questions this month about this. One was wanting to scatter a crowd with Forest Pack, but they wanted to create the kind of access walkways in it parametrically, which is something you could do quite easily in RailClone, but RailClone wasn't the right tool for this, because the other question was about using RailClone for this, but they wanted to animate the characters, and RailClone is modeling and layout tool and doesn't have the same sort of animation controls that Forest Pack does. So RailClone isn't really an ideal tool for doing that because the animation won't really sample correctly. So this is maybe a way of doing this. So the other thing you could do, of course, is to use that triangle technique I mentioned at the beginning with the tree basins. So you could set up your RailClone distribution with triangles and then pop animated characters on them in Forest Pack. But in this case, I just wanted to show you a quick thing with using spline offset, our free plugin, and some other bits and bobs that are just already existing in Max, just to parameterize the whole thing. That's the end. Let me try that again. Okay. So here we've got the kind of starting point. So what I've got here is a simple circular spline at the bottom here, which has got a spline offset modifier on there. So this is free from our website. You can download it. It allows you to basically create duplicates and offset them, rotate them, and change the distancing between them of splines using all kinds of welding techniques as well. It's a very cool plugin. So what we wanted to do is to create those gaps up here without necessarily having to go in and kind of edit that spline, because once I start editing it and kind of cutting bits out of it, I can't adjust it anymore. It's not so parametric. So what I thought was you could do it like this. So what we basically do is to create a rectangle that's, let's say this is the size that we want our access walkways to be. It's probably too big, but there you go. I then want to take the pivot point and I'm going to set it to the center there and reset the X-form. Okay, so now I can come into this and I'm going to use spline offset again. So this time I'll show you how to do it. So spline offset, there it is. So you can see by default it's trying to offset the spline by doing that. But I don't want to actually set a distance. Instead, I just want to set a rotation. So I'm going to go for 90 degrees and rotate it like that. And I want a couple more. There we go. So now what I want to do is to take this spline that's here, that the forest pack things are sat on, and I want to remove these walkways from that spline. But before I do that, I'm going to make a reference of it. So I'm going to do Control and V, and instead of instance, I'm going to make a reference. So I've got a reference for that there now. And while I've still got that selected now, I can come in and I'm going to use the compound shape object, shape Boolean object, basically. I can't remember when this was added, but it's a fairly recent-ish, or for me it is, addition to 3ds Max. And it basically lets me do some Booleans on splines, which is pretty cool because we can do stuff that and keep it all parametric and editable at any point. So I'm going to add that, add operand, change it to subtraction, and then pick the spline from the scene. Now you can see kind of what's happening there, but this isn't really cutting a hole in it in quite the way I'd like, because it's trying to be clever and create closed splines, which isn't what I want. So I'll change the mode to cookie down here, and now I've got what I'm after. Now the nice thing about this is that this is still procedural, so you know, if I come back into my rectangle, I could kind of change the angle of these still, and you can see it's all still updating live, which is cool. In fact, let's make that 45 degrees just to illustrate that. There you go. So that's fine, but the only issue is that the shape Boolean flattens the spline. It always does. So when I come into Forest Pack and I assign the scatter to this new spline I've just created, obviously what you're going to see is that it goes down to the ground. So how do you fix that? Well, there's an easy way, obviously. I mean, it's very likely if you're doing this that you've got a stadium which these people are stood on. In which case, all you'd need to do is add that stadium base mesh to the surfaces here. So in that case, then they'd move up to sit on the sort of area the chairs are sat on. So that would be fine. In the event that you haven't got that, then you could still do this completely procedurally by taking the original spline again, like cloning it once more as a reference, adding an renderable spline modifier, renderable. I know the alphabet. There it is. Making it rectangular, obviously. We don't really want any height. Bit of width, maybe. Other way around. Something like that. Just something. It doesn't have to be big, actually. Just something for them to sit on. Turn it off at render time. Change to an editable mesh. Editable poly. Doesn't really matter. And then we can come back into Forest Pack and we can add that to the surfaces rollout. Oh, trying to add itself. There we go. There we go. So now they're sat on that. Okay. So that's working great. And the nice thing, like I say, the nice thing about that is that it's all fully procedural. So I can come back into this original spline and I can go back to the circle and I can change the radius if I want. I can go to the spline offset and I can change the number of stalls that there are. I can change the distance between them, and you can do all kinds of anything else that you want. I can change the height, and it's all scattering procedurally. So it's a pretty good workflow using some of Max's built-in tools along with Forest Pack. How am I doing for time, Jaime? And are there any questions?
No questions so far. We got 5 minutes to go, so
5 minutes to go.
Yep.
Okie dokie. I can do this. I'm going to do 2 more, so I might overrun by 5, maybe a few minutes. Okay, so this was a question that relates to some of the deformation modes in RailClone. Those of you who use RailClone will know we've got the normal adaptive mode where, as you can see here, the segments come out kind of perpendicular to the spline. You've got vertical mode, which maintains vertical alignment, and you've got step mode. But what they wanted to do was to keep the adaptive deform mode without them banking, without the geometry banking as it follows curves. So easiest thing is probably to show you that. And it was for a pavement. So it was for paving slabs, paving stones, sorry, curbs even. It was for curbs which were following a curved road, but which you didn't want to bank because they followed the curved road. They needed to remain upright. And glad to know it's an easy fix. So just loading this up. Here we go. So here's a curb, and you can kind of see the issue as it follows this. This is a pretty extreme road, isn't it? But you can see that the curb is banking over here, whereas what they wanted to do is keep it upright. But what they didn't want to happen was for this to happen, because normally we'd just say use vertical mode, but you can see what happens in vertical mode. It keeps the verticals vertical as it should, fixes the banking problem, but there aren't really many curbs available that will perfectly match the slope angle of a road, so that's not really how things are going to look in real life. This is perhaps easier to see if we change this to arrows, so we can see in adaptive mode the problem a little bit clearer. There they are, facing over like that. So what we want to do is to keep that up. So the easy thing to do, now you know the problem, is to add a transform node in between. Go to deform, and then this is quite recently added, so you may not be aware of it. We've got this override banking and X rotation option, which will basically do what it says. I can turn that on, and it will allow me to control the angle around the slope instead of having it determined automatically with the banking. So in fact, you can change to anything you like. 90 degrees, for example, would have it facing perfectly inwards. But in this case, you want it 0, so it faces completely upwards. Now you might find you also need to increase the curve steps for this, because you can see it deforms a little bit abnormally, so you just need to increase the curve steps to give that a chance of deforming smoothly, but that gives you the effect you're after. And if this was a curb, you can see that's working much better now. It's vertical here, but the joints are still coming out perpendicular to the spline, which is what this particular user was after. And then coming back to our final case, which actually links, or was a question that was based on one of the things we talked about in the last live stream, which was how to create morphing facades. This was another example of that. So I won't go over the actual morphing part again, because you can go back and watch that, or maybe I'll go over it very briefly. But it was more how to create this kind of pattern here of diamonds in a way that will fit neatly into what is a 2D array, and we'll do so without slicing, so that you can use the morpher modifier. So let me just pop open this file. It starts with actually very simple pieces, you'll be glad to know. So I'm starting with just 2 pieces here. One which is the facade or shading elements which are closed, and the other which is them folded and open. And in both cases, if you can just see where the pivot is, it's basically smack in the middle of this piece of geometry. If you imagined it as a rectangle here, it's exactly in the middle. Now what I need to do is to get this into some kind of form that fits into a 2D array. So really what I want to do first of all is to make this into a square that can be then duplicated and mirrored around. So what I can do is take this, flip it on the X and flip it on the Y, and it will complete this little rectangle here. So that's what I'm going to do first of all. So here it is. I've already saved a bit of time by adding this geometry to the graph, and I've got it set up here. And I've got both pieces of geometry in here with a selector operator so that I can switch between them by just changing the index here. So I can go open or closed. Okay, so nothing particularly fancy there. So what I'm going to do is just build this up now. So what I want to do is to take a compose operator, because I want to compose this segment to make another, right? I want to fill in this gap basically. And I'm going to do that by adding a mirror to it. So I'm going to mirror this geometry around, wire it into the second input, and I'm going to change it on the X and the Y axis. Now, as you can see, one piece is butted up against the other, one's continuing after the other, and what we want to do is to align them based on those pivots that we just saw. So we can change the compose mode from sequential, where it puts one after the other, to grouped, where it aligns them based on their pivot points, and then you get that effect instead, which is more what we're after. So now it's a simple case of creating a pattern from that. So let's create a sequence node. Hello, I missed. Here's our sequence, and now we want to mirror that again. I think on the X-axis this time. You can experiment. Okay, so you can see that's starting to work. Starting to get my pattern. Now you can see what's happening is I've got the triangles pointing up, and then I've got the next low pointing up and pointing up. So obviously what I want to do is to mirror them as it increments on the Y-axis too. I want to mirror them on the Y. So what I'll do is add another sequence node, and then a mirror operator. Wire that into there, and that into there, and change the Y and turn off the X. And then what I need to do is to go into this sequence operator, and instead of it changing as it goes along the X-axis, change it to go goes on the Y-axis. So I'll change it to increment on Y, and there is our pattern, like so. So that's quite nice and straightforward. Just add a transform node in there, change the alignment on the Z-axis to pivot, just to pull in the corners a bit. We can play with that. Okay, so that's kind of working. That creates quite a nice pattern, but you can see all I've had to do there is just basically sequence it for using some mirrors. So I'm sequencing on X in this case, sequencing on Y, and from those just one actually very small simple piece you can create quite a complex pattern. And I've also got this index operator down here that lets me switch from open to closed, like that. And the advantage of having that now is that I can do my morph, right? So again, I'm not going to go over this in a lot of depth because we did this a few weeks ago, month ago. So I'll turn it into a mesh so I can certainly sample it. I'm going to turn on my morpher modifier at the top here. Delete that. And then what I want to do is to basically capture a morph state from this. So I'll come down to RailClone. I will make sure this is set to open. So I've opened up the facade. Now I'll capture that state. So in my morpher modifier, I'll come down here and say capture current state. Give it a name, doesn't really matter. And leave it like that. Then I'll come back down to RailClone. Go back to its closed state. So now if you imagine in the bottom here, I've got it in its closed state, and the top morpher modifier here, I've got it in its open state, and I can animate between those by changing this value. And that is pretty much it. So if I put that up to 100%, then I can go into this volume select, turn that on, and then I'm using a volume select with a noise map to randomly pick vertices and pass them up to the morpher modifier to get some interesting facade shapes there. So I'm aware that I'm skimming over that, but if you're interested in that part, you missed the last month, then you can see that's in the August live stream, this technique with using volume select and morpher modifiers, and that will help you to learn that bit. But it was sort of more about, you know, how you can use this simple triangle to create this quite interesting facade shape. So I found that to be an interesting case to help answer. Lovely. So I think we're out of time.
Yep.
If I'm not wrong. Are there any final questions?
Not at all.
Not at all. Okay.
Nope.
Well, if you've got any questions for next month, then keep them coming and let us know. Certainly happy to answer any that have been sent in since then. That 3D array question I will make a note of. If you've got, like I say, if you've got an example, then send it in. Otherwise, I shall make one up. But I think it's a good question, actually, how to create 3D arrays. So I'll definitely deal with that. Other than that, I don't think we've got any other news. Please go and give Forest Pack 8 a go. Let us know what you think of the new features. Have we got anything to add, Jaime?
Nope, it's seeing everyone in a month, and we hope you guys have a great time.
Lovely.
Yep.
See you soon.
Adios. Cheers.